Thank you, Elle. Just before I introduce our next speaker, I'd just like to share that I was also in Syria last year with Elle and Reem, and I also got to meet a number of Syrian women whilst I was there. And I'm not going to share any stories, but I will just note that I am also Syrian, of Syrian background, and I never felt so proud to be not only Syrian, but Syrian woman as I did when I was in Syria because of the women that I met there and the stories that I heard. Everyone in Syria has a horrible story to tell. And it's really sad to listen to. But one of the most beautiful things at the same time was seeing the strength and the courage and the resilience of the Syrian women whilst they told their stories. I think one of the first times I cried in Syria, I'd been there for a couple of weeks already, and I was listening to a story from a girl named Hala that I met there. And I think what destroyed me the most was her strength while she was speaking and she was sharing her story with me. I just couldn't believe how strong and brave she was while she was sharing that. And so, yes, I just wanted to say that even in the face of all these atrocities and all these horrible things, the Syrian people and the Syrian women in particular, who are not only the backbone of their family, but they're the backbone of the whole country. And that was something we got to witness while we were in Syria. Ladies and gentlemen, our final speaker for this evening is maybe very well known to all of you. She's a very popular and outspoken Syrian activist, and she has appeared on a number of international news channels, including SBS, RT News, and even Press TV. She's here tonight to discuss the refugee camps in neighbouring Syrian countries, as well as the role the media has played to promote wars by exploiting the rights of women. Please welcome Mimi Al-Laham, and also better known as Syrian Girl.
How do I get that? Oh, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Jasmine, for that introduction. I'm just trying to figure out how this works. Okay, cool. And is it spacebar? For the arrow. Okay. So my talk is a little bit different to everybody else's because they have their personal experiences with their recent trip in Syria, but mine is going to talk more generally about how the media has promoted wars by actually exploiting women's rights, and not just in Syria, but lastly in Syria. I'm also going to touch on the Iraq war, the war in Afghanistan, Libya, and then finally Syria. And the use of women's rights in media to promote war really influences liberal thinkers who wouldn't normally support a war if it was sold on imperialism alone. And the question is, does these wars actually improve the rights of women in the end, or does it create problems for women? And this is not going to be extensive research over this topic, but just slices of imagery, and I hope you can forgive me for that. Well, of course, this is a very well-known image of Afghan women in burqas, and it's undeniable that the Taliban were and are very repressive of women. Under the Taliban, women weren't afforded basic freedoms, like not represented in government, burqas are compulsory, and they're banned from going to school above the age of 8, just so they wouldn't intermix with the opposite sect. The reason the Taliban are in power, in fact, was because the US supported very, very extremist factions of Mujahideen and Islamists to overthrow the liberal government of the time that was actually backed by the Soviet Union. And I could go on and on about Brzezinski's policies, but instead I'm going to take a shortcut and show you this well-known image of Rambo 3, which is a movie, an American movie depicting Rambo fighting alongside the Taliban, which represents the idea that Americans were given about the Taliban at the time, that they were heroes. And these two images are the result of 30 years of war in Afghanistan, and this is actually in Kabul, which is the main city. And you can see that Afghan women were not as they are seen now, and in fact Afghanistan as a whole was really much better off before all these wars. In 1962, these females were medical students in Kabul. So how did the media sell the war on Afghanistan in 2001? Well, they told us that because the Taliban exploits these women, that the Afghan women need another war to liberate them. And George Bush actually lined up a group of influential women, liberal feminist organizations, and told them that they need to press for the case for war to liberate Afghan women. And here's an example of Amnesty International spreading the perception that the war in Afghanistan was about women's liberation. So over a decade of war after that, women's rights are no better under the current Northern Alliance Karzai regime. An Afghan feminist, Malala Joya, writes in her memoirs, A Woman Among Warlords, "It was dust in the eyes of the world. The United States has tried to justify its occupation with rhetoric about liberating Afghan women, but we remain caged in our country." So on to Iraq, and well, you could say a lot about Saddam Hussein and the crimes that he committed, but women's rights in Iraq were better than the majority of other Middle Eastern nations. They had the right to run for office that was enshrined in the constitution, and their literacy was 87% in 1985, which was pretty good for the region. Yet women's rights was surprisingly still exploited to sell the Iraq war. Bush and his neocons asserted that Saddam and his son ran rape rooms, and there was no physical evidence of these rape rooms, but it was excellent pre-war propaganda. And here's some excerpts from comments. This is by Paul Bremer in 2003. "The Iraqi people are now free, and they do not have to worry that their wives are being taken to rape rooms." And here's George Bush in 2003 at a Republicans gala. He, Saddam, no longer got rape rooms. This is just his way of speaking. No longer raping young girls or having girls raped, and that every woman in Iraq is better off because the rape rooms and torture chambers of Saddam Hussein are forever closed. But of course, some torture rooms and rape rooms were in fact opened up in Abu Ghraib, as we saw, where both men and women reported rape and sexual humiliation. So women's rights advocates have been reporting that they were better off under Saddam Hussein than under the regime that was installed by the United States. This is a quote by one of them. "Before the US-led invasion in 2003, women were free to go to school, universities, work, and perform other duties. Now, due to security reasons and repression by the government, they're being forced to stay in their homes. 25% of marriages in Iraq are now currently involved under the age of 18 years old since 2011. So now, onto a more recent war, the war in Libya. Now again, you can say a lot about Gaddafi, but Gaddafi actually was, at least on the surface, a big promoter of women's rights. And once again, he tried to run a government that supported empowerment of women. And it was similar to that of Iraq. So what happened? The rape room story resurfaced in the mainstream media. Here is just one example of the rape room story, the macabre rape chambers of Gaddafi. So these women were actually Gaddafi's personal guards. He had many hundreds of them at any one time. They were his bodyguards, and they were sort of a symbol of his advocacy of women's rights. So this symbol had to be torn down. Not long before the NATO bombing campaign, 5 supposedly former Gaddafi guards were reporting rape by Gaddafi to the media. It sort of ignores the logical fallacy of raping someone that is actually guarding you with a gun. But in 1998, one of Gaddafi's female guards was actually killed taking a bullet for him. So again, it sort of defies logic that all of these women were raped, and also the claim was conveniently timed. Whether you choose to believe it or not, it was used in the media. So what happens to the status of Libyan women after the war? The first law passed by the new Libyan government was to repeal a law that prevented men from marrying more than one wife if they did not first seek the permission of their wife. So this was the very first law, not the very first law to do with women, but the very first law at all, which sort of shows you what that revolution was for. A Libyan writer, Aisha al-Maghrabi, says women were part of Libya's revolution, but see no political benefits from them. We were the spoils of war. Unless immediate changes are enforced, Libya is heading towards Afghanistan. So here's a striking example of this. Women's rights advocate Magdalena Abaida, who's actually a strong backer of NATO and the Libyan rebels under the banner that they would improve women's rights, attended a conference about the status of women in Libya in Benghazi in 2012, where afterwards she was kidnapped and beaten by the rebels that she supported, and they told her that if she were to return, she would be killed and that nobody would know about it. So she decided to leave. So now on to Syria. It's very similar, as you've heard from the other guests, that Syrian women enjoyed great rights, and Syria was a progressive society when it comes to women's rights. They could be government officials, doctors, lawyers. So what does the media need to do is to represent something that was completely different. And this is the blogger Amina Abdallah, who was a supposedly gay girl in Damascus who supported the revolution and was talking about how it's going to lead to better women's rights in the region. However, this gay girl in Damascus turns out to be a 40-year-old man in Scotland. Oh, yes, he's living in Scotland, but he's from America, thank you. His name is Tom McMaster, and he stole the profile photos from a Croatian woman by the name of Jelena Lekic from her Facebook profile. So his wife was actually a significant figure, in fact. He's just not some random weirdo. Her name is Britta Frolischer, and she's an Israeli woman doing a master's degree at the Center for Syrian Studies at St. Andrews University. And she actually has written for Joshua Landis's Syria Comment, which is a very, very well-known blog about Syria that is related to the US State Department as well. The Joshua Landis is a State Department advisor. So the question is, did his wife contribute to the blog, and did she use her connections to promote the blog to the mainstream media? Because in fact, the mainstream media ran very hard with this story. It was everywhere. This Syrian gay girl in Damascus is the heroine of the Syrian revolution. She is the figure that the Syrian revolution looks up to. And this particular article is many, many pages long, but in the end, she says, Abdullah is writing a book, Abdullah is the gay girl in Damascus, in the hope that a revolution will bring more freedoms, both sexual and political, suggesting that this revolution is a liberal revolution that's just going to turn this backwards Syrian state into a modern society. So what has actually happened after this, the pushing of this war and this insurgency? Syrian girls, especially those who have become refugees, are facing rape, sex trafficking, and are sold into early marriages. And of course, as was touched on, they're also facing draconian laws under religious police in rebel-held areas. And of course, not to mention the loss of life suffered by women as a result of all of these wars. So the girls that are being sold off into marriage in the refugee camps are in their preteen and early teen ages in some cases. And Justine Greening, which is International Development Secretary, said, today 20% of Syrian girls are now married by the time they reach the age of 16, which is a shocking statistic. And basically, the countries that have backed the insurgency, such as Jordan and Saudi Arabia, are the main buyers of Syrian girls. So Syrian girls have become loot for the nations that have backed the insurgency. So I'm going to have to, this crashed before, so I had to make the video separate. And I don't want to recreate the wheel, so you're going to have to watch a video from a different media. It's in German, but the translation's at the bottom.